So this is CNN actually doing really interesting journalism, going to Bukele's jails in El Salvador and exposing what it looks like on the inside. I play this for you for two reasons. Number one, because I have a slightly personal connection with El Salvador, which I will tell you about later. And two, because Bukele offered to take any nationality's prisoners and house them in Salvadorian jail for a fee. That would include U.S. citizens. But first, I'm going to play this for you. I might comment on it occasionally, but it's really interesting. Here we go.
All right, we're gonna go in here.
Even as I'm stepping through these doors, I don't fully grasp what we're about to walk into. Suddenly, you're hit with the intense gaze of dozens locking onto you. These men described as the worst of the worst, tattooed with reminders of El Salvador's dark past.
Those are the MS-13 gang members that Bukele has locked up that held El Salvador, the entire country, in terror for decades. Just pure evil is what they are.
Tense and uncomfortable. But here, officials say comfort isn't meant to exist.
There's no mattresses, there's no sheets. You've got a toilet over here for them to go to the bathroom. You've got this basin here that they use to bathe themselves. And then you can see there's a barrel of water that they can drink from.
This is a rare look inside El Salvador's terrorism confinement center, known as scourge.
And he says there's always somebody standing here in front of the cells. And then if you look up, there's another corridor with more security personnel. Luz 24 horas. 24/7
24
light.
hours of light.
The prison sits like an isolated fortress, nestled in mountainous terrain, about an hour and a half drive from the capital. Even with government officials on board with us, we're stopped a mile out.
Oh, okay. He's gonna inspect bags now too. Okay, we're clear to get back in.
Only to hit another checkpoint. Approaching the main gate, our cell signals vanish.
They want to do a full search on us before we enter.
Secot's director, Belarmino Garcia, greets us and takes us through a rigorous security check.
Wedding ring. So this is like airport security on steroids. Anything that we're carrying with us. Móvil aquí, teléfono.
Prisoners have so many different ways of smuggling in contraband goods into prison, and I guarantee that these prisoners would use anything they could against the guards given the opportunity.
Okay, anything we're carrying with us has to go there, and then there's a body scan that continues on the other side. Okay, shoes off, this one back on. Gracias.
Once cleared, we toured the vast campus, starting with the armory.
He says they have to constantly remind themselves that they're dealing with essentially the worst of the worst, and for that reason, they need to be ready for whatever risks they might face. It's been equated to 7 football stadiums. It's almost multiple prisons within the prison. You can see off to the distance, there's 3 different rings as they describe. The far end, you have one that's 9 meters high of concrete, and then above that, 3 meters of electrified fencing.
15,000 volts.
15,000 volts.
More than 1,000 security
Electrified.
personnel, guards, police, and military are stationed on site. Inmates are assigned to one of 8 sectors.
The director tells me the inmates, once they're inside one of these sectors, they never leave. Everything is done within, including doctors, as well as legal visits or court hearings.
Each sector holds more than 24 large cells.
Roughly 80 inmates per cell, but it can fluctuate.
Most bear the markings of the gangs that held this nation hostage for decades, committing brutal acts of violence.
You gotta kill people, you gotta rob, you gotta do what you gotta do to survive.
You have to do those things.
Yeah, you gotta do that.
And if you didn't do those things, you wouldn't.
You wouldn't be a gangbanger.
We meet 41-year-old Marvin Vasquez, shackled and heavily guarded.
What gang were you part of?
MS-13.
And do you have any gang affiliations?
That was the gang that basically took over the entire nation.
Yeah, I'm tattooed up.
What is this?
Crazy criminal. Say crazy criminals. Yeah.
CC,
I made this
crazy
click
criminal.
in 2011.
You made the click.
Yeah.
You were a gang leader.
Yeah.
What is it like to live here?
It's probably not a hotel 5-star, but they give you the 3 times the food. They give you some programs. You go to do exercise.
Ejercicio nosotros lo podemos repetir siempre.
Some church religion programs too.
But that's limited to just 30 minutes a day. The other 23 and a half hours, they're kept inside and locked up.
For inmates who get violent with other prisoners or guards,
We're going to close the door. I just want to get a sense of... Wow.
solitary confinement awaits.
The only light you get is through this hole. And they can be in here for 15 days, potentially. All right, I'm ready to get out.
Imagine that.
Critics
This is what
point
happens as a
specifically to
criminal
the prison's strict
the new
control and
world.
isolation of inmates, calling it a violation of human rights.
The director brought up that a lot of folks will raise concerns from a human rights perspective and an abuse of human rights, that he's calm hearing that because he sees it day to day, the process they go through to maintain, as he sees it, proper punishment.
While you're cut off from society here, whispers of life on the outside make their way in.
I've heard about it, that it's a new El Salvador, it looks different.
That new
Did you see that? He was actually beaming with pride for his country. He recognizes, in my estimation, that him and his gang helped destroy people's lives, but he still has hope for the rest of the country, and thus he's filled with pride that El Salvador has been salvaged, saved. El Salvador in Spanish means the savior, and that is kind of what Bukele, the current president, is there.
El Salvador has emerged under President Nayib Bukele, who took office in 2019 and declared a controversial state of emergency more than 2 years ago. It sparked an aggressive crackdown on crime. We see that firsthand as some 2,500 police and soldiers deploy into one neighborhood.
Is going to go on through the night for however long it takes for them to root out
Colonia 10 de octubre.
any suspected criminal elements.
Late last week, as the U.S. State Department lowered its travel advisory for El Salvador, citing a significant reduction in crime, it also warned that Bukele's emergency measures allow authorities to arrest anyone suspected of gang activity and suspends constitutional rights.
Hola. Juan Carlos, yo soy David.
Juan Carlos tells me he was wrongfully held for 5 months at a lower security prison earlier this year. He says the poor conditions led to an infection in his leg.
He said he was lumped in and assumed to be part of a gang, and he said in part because of how he looked. He had long hair, he said he had a long beard, and he says he has tattoos, but he points out that for him these are just artistic expressions. They have nothing to do with being part of a gang.
The Bukele administration has acknowledged that innocent people have been swept up in the crackdown, and they say more than 7,000 have already been released. They see it as collateral damage, and Juan Carlos, while frustrated with the tactics, believes under Bukele his country is safer.
Could you imagine that, having 5 months of your life essentially taken away and getting an infection in prison and harboring no ill will, seemingly, according to this report, towards the president and those who committed this act against you because you recognize that overall the country is going in the right direction?
Is this headquarters for you guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Bukele's security minister targets gangs with an academic-like approach.
I heard you have a book. Is it true?
Yeah.
And this is a book that has the markings of gang members.
All the marks.
The minister compiling his findings from his nearly 30 years in law enforcement to help interpret gang symbols.
Wow, these 3 dots that says signify 3 things to the gang members, that they have 3 destinations essentially: jail, hospital, or cemetery.
From his office, he monitors crime reports in real time and keeps
That's your
tabs on his
future as a gang
officers in the
member.
field.
You can say, if there's a particular officer that's in an area that's in question, why were you there so long? What were you doing?
Of course.
And you can hold them accountable.
He even says the program they've built has started to incorporate AI, which can tell them
Where you have to put your police officer.
and yet most we meet seem unfazed by the added show of force.
I asked him, I said, how do you feel with all these soldiers? I mean, there's a couple of dozen just even right outside his door. And he said, no, I feel safe.
A lot safer with them than the MS-13.
I sat next to Jorge Moran on my flight in. His family fled El Salvador's civil war when he was 3.
Just coming to the airport, you feel the sense of like safety,
Do you feel it in the U.S.?
No.
You don't?
No.
And you live in Indiana?
Yes, sir.
Jorge fully supports President Bukele, as do most arriving passengers, it seems.
And folks are actually stopping to get...
Bukele has an 86% approval rating in El Salvador. I think it's actually higher than that. It might be in the 90s. It's very high.
Their pictures taken between President Bukele and the First Lady.
Under Bukele's state of emergency, law enforcement have arrested more than 81,000 people. El Salvador now has one of the world's highest incarceration rates. Most end up in facilities like these, where they can work to reduce their sentences. The most hardened criminals, though, brought to scourge, where inside, a life sentence awaits.
We did bad things, we pay it the rough way, doing time.
And yet for many on the outside, the prison, now a symbol of newfound freedom, the new El Salvador, as they see it.
I want to give CNN tremendous credit for this small 9-minute documentary. They did a great job displaying what goes on in the prisons, even just in that short period of time. Now, in terms of my personal connection to El Salvador, I had a longtime maid who was Salvadorian when I lived in Los Angeles, and she is the definition of a refugee. Her son was a bus driver in the capital city, and they held him up at gunpoint and told him to give the little jar of change that he collected. And he refused, and in 2 seconds, they shot him, and he died. And she fled El Salvador and came to the United States. That is actually somebody who has reason to fear for her life, as do many Salvadorians based on what happened. Now, you can blame the U.S. to some degree for having created the environment that the gang would form, thus you would gain internal protection. There is some truth there. But in terms of what the Salvadorians do today, I could not imagine having my children slaughtered because the gang wanted a few cents to pad their pockets with. The gang used to hold people up and they acted as a mafia, taking 40% of the earnings of people that were making a couple of dollars a day at best, and you had to pay or else you got shot. You could not leave certain areas that were guarded very closely and cordoned off. If you did, you were liable to kidnap or death. That's what it was like in El Salvador before Bukele. And now he comes under fire from some leftists in the United States because of his heavy hand, they say, because he's taking away the rights of these people. And it's, what else do you expect? How else are you going to restore order once it disappears, once this virulent strain of evil percolates and extends itself and forms a mass? You have to do something with great strength in order to take it down. And that's why you cannot allow these things to fester. This is an invasion of a virus. In this case, in the US, it's the woke mind virus, it's the communists, the leftists. In El Salvador, it was the gangs. And this is a natural way that you must go about and combat it. You don't do it in a friendly manner. You do it with the antibiotic that you have, and that is force, and that is imprisoning them. Now, in terms of U.S. citizens going to El Salvador to serve their sentences, I'm not sure I agree with that. But the fact that President Trump is sending people to Guantanamo Bay who are in the country illegally and have committed heinous crimes, and is now has the option potentially to send them to Sicot in El Salvador, this massive prison there, that will act as a deterrent, if nothing else, for people coming to the country and committing crimes, because they recognize that this is a potential avenue that their life will go down. And advertising this fact and making it public is part of using your power without having to use it, because you can scare people off before they commit these heinous acts or decide to step over the border. The Biden administration has abdicated their responsibility to the Americans, to the American citizen, in an effort to garner more and more voters that would put them over the top on a permanent basis. But now you see what's going on in El Salvador. I hope I've explained a little bit. And to my maid, Blanca, God bless you and your son. I'm sorry for his loss. And I know for a fact, because I've spoken to her, that she's happy about what's going on in El Salvador, as are many Salvadorians. It is now the safest country in the Western Hemisphere, from being the worst to the safest. And when you get results like that, you deserve to be acknowledged. And Bukele is, with his massive approval rating. And thank God that Trump is doing something similar in America before it gets to the level where you have to employ that type of force. This is the art of negotiation that Trump is doing, and the actions that he's taken, I support. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Peace.